All right, this is going to serve as our introduction to China and Chinese politics. So, to start with, we are going to think a little bit about why China is part of the coursework for AP Comparative Government Politics. So, China is illustrative of a lot of different concepts in class. So, we I've heard somebody say that thinking about the Chinese Communist Party, there's oftentimes way too much emphasis put on the communist part and not enough on the word Chinese. And I think that's definitely true, kind of thinking about how China's unique history and the 2 or 3 thousand years of really um, deep political history within China shapes what the modern Chinese state looks like today. So Chinese unique history sort of greatly shapes the political culture and the social culture that sort of is intertwined with its politics. Um, and China is one of the remaining communist countries in the world, sort of in name. There are still ways in which, especially the political establishment in China, reflects sort of the initial implementation of kind of the communist system by Mao Zedong in the 1940s and 1950s. But it has made a successful, in terms of the economic progress for the country, kind of a successful move away from a command economy to a more market-based economy since the reforms in the 1970s within China. But one thing that hasn't reformed much are the actual political institutions within the country, in the fact that they are still highly authoritarian, and they still kind of have these vanguardism reflected kind of filtering of a few people running the country. Not a few people running the country, but the filtering to the top of kind of the most capable as judged by their system to rule the country or to govern the country. So some questions to think about as we study China. Um, so one of the big questions that was asked in the United States and throughout the kind of Western democracies of the world in the 1980s, 1990s, and even the 2000s is that as China continues to develop, economically speaking, and they implement successful market-based reforms, will that be followed by democratization? Will there be things like elections? And so far, not really. We haven't seen that prediction that a lot of people made that we would have successful political liberalization in China to kind of follow the economic liberalization that happened in the 1970s, the 1980s, 1990s, and so on. So that's a question to keep thinking about. The other one is China's classified as an authoritarian regime, and yet China's government still seems to have pretty high levels of responsiveness to its citizens in a lot of ways. So thinking about kind of China as an authoritarian regime, how does political participation work in a country that doesn't necessarily have or doesn't have free elections? So that is another thing to think about as we think about China. And there are lots of other topics and things to cover as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the geography of China. So geography is really, really important within China because a lot of the arguments and a lot of the trouble that China has with the United States and with other countries in the world have to do with the idea of Chinese sovereignty. So thinking about China politically, we see kind of the distinctions that are made internally within China. So you have this is mostly mainland China, and then you have some interesting political distinctions within China. So first, in green, you have 5 autonomous regions that are created by the Chinese government. So most notably, those are Xinjiang and Tibet. Xinjiang is a autonomous region within China that mostly inhabited by an ethnic minority group of mostly Muslim populations named the Uyghurs, and they have and then Tibet. And both of these regions have seen really heavy-handed attempts by the Chinese government to essentially integrate these kind of autonomous regions into the rest of the Chinese political system. So in the news recently, you maybe have heard a lot of about kind of treatment of the Uyghurs, the forced relocation of Uyghur populations, and other forms of violence by the state against people within autonomous regions. So that is kind of a subset of ethnic cleavages that we're going to talk a lot about within class. So other kind of big issues of sovereignty in China are Taiwan and Hong Kong. So we're not going to get deep into the political history of Taiwan and Hong Kong at the moment, but essentially Taiwan is considered by China to be part of China, but is governed sort of self-governed, and has been and used to be recognized by many other countries, including the United States, as an independent state until the 1970s. So we're going to talk about issues of Taiwan, and then we're also going to talk about Hong Kong and sort of how it, as after being a former colony along with Macau, how it is being reintegrated into China and some of the difficulties that exist with that. So you can see kind of the even though China is a unitary state, some of the interesting distinctions that are made up that make up China's political map. All right, and here is an interesting view of China's passport that actually has territory on it that is either disputed by other states, or things like Taiwan that are oftentimes disputed as whether or not they are part of China. But China is deeply and fiercely committed to maintaining what their view of sovereignty is. So there's going to be a lot of sort of talk about that within class. So thinking about China's government, so you see here a very, very rudimentary kind of organizational chart for China's government. And the policy making essentially takes place a lot in the middle column, the Communist Party. So China's government, there's a lot of different classifications for it. But sort of one-party rule, one-party authoritarianism, all of those are sort of interesting and apt classifications, I think. And you see kind of the two or three kind of things at the very top are the most important: the Central Committee, the Standing Committee, and the General Secretary of the Communist Party. And one thing to mention as we look at this is China has a lot of party institutions, and they have a lot of official state institutions. And oftentimes the state and the party institutions are sort of operate at a parallel level, with the party overseeing in many ways what kind of these state organizations are doing. So there is this sort of parallel organization of the state and the Communist Party, and at times the military as well. So we'll talk about kind of the Communist Party first, because that's where the most important kind of mechanism of policymaking happens. But we will also talk about the official sort of institutions of the state and some of the other things that take place within the Chinese government. All right, so the basics. We've mentioned before, authoritarianism. So thinking about China and its relationship to the other authoritarian states, Russia and Iran, how they are different and how they are similar. And also thinking about how authoritarianism operates differently than liberal or illiberal democracy. So like I said, how does political participation work in a state that's authoritarian? That's an interesting question, and one we'll dive into. And then thinking about how the Communist Chinese Party, or the Chinese Communist Party, operates is really important as well. So China's unitariness, again, that kind of goes in with the Communist Party. So in what ways does China operate as a unitary state? In what ways does it have differentiation kind of under the umbrella of the Chinese state? So we think about thinking about Hong Kong, you have things like the One China, Two Systems policy that it's had in the past and continues to have today, kind of to operate as Hong Kong operates much differently than the rest of China, at least for now. Thinking about its electoral system, there is no electoral system. There are maybe small amounts of elections that might happen at a very local level, but essentially you have a separate system that does not involve free and fair elections, which, like I said, kind of is contributes to its labeling as an authoritarian state. So China's current head of party and head of state would be President Xi Jinping, and we will talk a lot about him and his accumulation of power and what the future with him might look like. There's a lot of questions as to what his role is going to be going forward. And then as China is classified sometimes as a dual executive system, also thinking about the head of government, who is Premier Li Keqiang, and thinking about kind of his role as the premier, and kind of having some oversight of the internal runnings of the state. So China has a dual executive system in many ways. And China has a unicameral legislature. So it would be classified as a rubber stamp legislature, and its purpose oftentimes is to validate public opinion-wise, or kind of publicly decisions that are made by the hierarchy that exists within the CCP. And then we will also talk about the rule of law in China and essentially the judicial branch and what its role in sort of supporting the CCP is. So not surprisingly, when we look at the legislature and the judicial branch of government in China, their roles are not independent. They serve to kind of validate a lot of what's happening within the political system elsewhere. All right. So last thing, other important issues. Thinking about China, how is it going to maintain these high levels of economic growth that it's had over the last 30 or 40 years while transitioning into a post-industrial economy, which it is probably doing at this point. Issues of sovereignty always loom large with China, as well as issues of ethnic and political separatism. So Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, South China Seas, disputes with other powers, disputes potentially with ethnic minorities within the state, its relationship with the United States and other powers that are in the region, Japan, India, are always important when it comes to China. One other thing that I think is really important, doesn't get enough play, are demographic issues that exist within China. So China, because in many ways of the one-child policy, is facing an interesting kind of population structure where they might have rapid aging, and not enough population to support kind of the old age population that lives within the country. So kind of China's migration policies are going to be interesting and very important. How is China going to manage internal migration within the country, as it has had one of the largest human migrations in world history over the last 30 or 40 years in terms of the rural to urban migration that's taken place. And lastly, the power of Xi Jinping. He's the most powerful leader in the country since Deng Xiaoping in the 1970s. So what happens as he continues to consolidate power, and what happens after his term? And that term is in quotation marks because they officially limited term limits for the president, or they officially took away the limits for term limits for the president a few years ago. But there's a lot going on with that. So this is just a little bit of an introduction of kind of important stuff with China. So there you go.